So it's my pleasure to be here, and I've had the luxury of having Alexis kind of serve up a primer a little bit on the conservation guide. So forestry for Minnesota birds has been a labor of love for a number of years now. And I've worked with the initiative wearing multiple hats, first with the American Bird Conservancy and now with the University of Minnesota Extension as a forest-dependent wildlife educator. So today's agenda, we're going to pop back into the decline of bird species across kind of all forests and really all habitat types really quickly. And then the history of the Forestry for Minnesota Birds Initiative, and then we'll begin to take a dive into the guide. So really want to touch again on how important the study that came out in 2019, the decline of North American avifauna, notably showcasing that 1 in 4 birds are gone since 1970, 2.9 billion birds over that time. And one of the things that I sort of saw in this, and I like to say each time I talk about it, is that decline does not appear to start in 1970, but rather was probably already at a pretty, downward trajectory, maybe decades before that. So the decline in species is maybe even more dramatic than what has been indicated in that paper, if that timeline goes back even farther. So you can see across numerous habitats, notably in Minnesota, boreal forest with over 30% decline, 33%. Our western forests as well, our eastern forests as well, which overlaps here in Minnesota and across the Great Lakes region. But not just forest specialists, but also forest generalists as well. We know that some of those were doing okay, as was notable in the data that was shown by Alexis. But we also know that we've been seeing declines across kind of all species and habitat types. Notably, some wetland species have increased over time, and that was in response to conservation actions that had a notable increase in populations after they fell precipitously following, like DDT and its use decades ago. So what's going on with birds? Well, there's a lot of intersecting threats from habitat loss on winter stopover breeding grounds, fragmentation of habitats and land use change. We see changing forest demographics that maybe have led to less diversity at multiple scales, climate change, insect invasion, collisions as well, a lot of those human factors, pesticide use. There's all of these different intersecting threats, and it's led to declines, not just in one habitat, but all habitat types. Not just our long distance migrants, so we can't just blame across the pond, and not just habitat specialists, and not just birds. We've seen a decline in biodiversity across all habitats as well. Birds just happen to be really well studied. So I think we've heard a couple of times like, oh, we need to study this more or that more. And birds have had a good amount of a microscope on them for a number of years. We understand their habitats and their use, some of their specializations. And really, they're a canary in the coal mine. Maybe there's a number of different canaries and a number of different coal mines across habitats throughout the Americas, which lead us to understand that the decline is across area insectivores, boreal forest species, eastern forest species, migratory birds, and that maybe that loss in population numbers and biodiversity extends across wildlife types, and both ecological and biological species. So what's going on with birds? Well, our solution, hopefully, is to cross ownership boundaries and management boundaries, engage public and private audiences to create a resource that people can use to incorporate some additional considerations into their habitat management. So we, spent a lot of time talking about what would go into a guide. A lot of people during COVID made sourdough starter. We started Forestry for Minnesota Birds. I also started some sourdough starter, which still exists. It was really a labor of love when people were just giving their time and we didn't have a lot of resources. But we wanted to provide land managers and owners with science-based practices that they can bring into a forest management setting and have conservation action make some sort of unified push to incorporate these considerations across ownerships and management specialties. So at that point in time, maybe we can mitigate and arrest some of these declines. So we have developed a community initiative. We've found some funding, and I'll get into a little bit of a timeline soon, but we wanted to focus on actionable strategies. We can talk for a long time about what's going on with certain species and certain habitats, but we really wanted to be able to understand what we could actually do that could move the needle. And so we wanted to also incorporate resources, not just for bird species, but other wildlife, considerations that would assist forest health, ecosystem resilience. And so as we look into the future, we're going to continue this initiative. It's living and it's breathing. We may have more guides, more supplemental conservation printouts or resources that go along with this guide, and outreach and education events that bring our experts and the information they have to bear for not just natural resource professionals, but for the public and the landowners who also are critical to habitat management in the state of Minnesota. And we're going to continue to work with our content experts over time and make sure that the research that they develop doesn't just sit on a shelf and collect dust. So, I mean, everything collects a little bit of dust until you brush it off. And that was sort of the Forestry for Minnesota Birds initiative in Minnesota. In 2008, Vermont developed that first guide. We did a lot of content examination in the first few years. I really recommend taking a look at the Vermont guide and a number of the others. There's some great stuff in there. Everyone kind of takes their own approach. And a lot of the guidance in those others are usable in your own work here in Minnesota. But the Forest Stewards Guild, American Bird Conservancy, and RRI tried to get some funding through LCCMR and got shot down, but that was okay because we came back stronger. And Peg Robertson, who I saw and is in the room, set up a meeting and kind of got the band back together. And I took coordinator role from her after the fact, and we just started getting people together, trying to identify who the right people were to have in the room, content experts, foresters, biologists, and really get a team of all-stars together so that as we worked together and finally did identify funding, we would have done some content review and gotten to the point where we could really start putting the pen to the page as far as a guide. So working with the Upper Mississippi Great Lakes Joint Venture, we were able to get some funding. That funding went towards hiring a coordinator, Christian Nelson, who's in the room, and Jamie Strange, the Northern Forest Bird Network coordinator. And we really started to hit the ground running and developed that guide soon after in 2023-24 is when we were working on it and produced it. And we really stood on the shoulders of giants. We didn't reinvent what we didn't need to. And NRRI, along with Christian, played a critical role. And I can't really thank you guys enough for the hard work that went into creating that guide, because everyone from the writing to the graphic design to the specialized input from like notable scientific giants in the field, like we couldn't have gotten to where we were today without everyone lending a hand. And really the steps to get there were profound as well. So everything from the first meetings and talking about what we would want and doing sticky board stuff to developing the content, and to the eventual print and distribution to where we are today when we can sit down and open it up, which hopefully you guys all have one. There's a couple right outside. We're going to do a little tour here in a little bit, so feel free to grab one. So our mission statement: promoting sustainable forestry practices to benefit native bird species across Minnesota forest landscape by designing and sharing a conservation toolkit for landowners and natural resource professionals. And really, we're trying to arrest the decline, maybe even increase it, solve that biodiversity problem by encouraging ecological stewardship of our landscape. And again, just notable, like such a team of incredible people. And then we came to our product. So Minnesota is a biodiversity hotspot for birds because of those intersecting ecological provinces, Laurentian mixed forest, eastern broadleaf forest. The Aspen parklands give us our third biome for forested landscape, but we also have the tall grass prairie not so far away. So we have those interesting intersections as well, like oak savanna, which give us just a range of incredible habitat types. Tiny bit misleading on the species richness, which we do have incredible species richness for forest bird species, but notable that it only accounts for in that graphic forest bird species. So the Dakotas aren't absent species. They just happen to not be forest birds. So we really wanted to help give the ability to use the best available science for avian ecology and best management practices, but provide it in a way that aligns with landowner goals, keeps our forests healthy, promotes resilience, is incorporative of adapting to things like climate change and other realities on the ground and our shifting landscape. And so we also want to take a look at how we can improve not just our present habitat, but those habitats for future generations. So the selection process was pretty intense. We had to whittle from 250 birds, bird species in Minnesota, 150 in the forests, down to 18. So we wanted them to be common enough, but that you could actually see them occasionally in the forest. They had to be specialized enough to be within a certain habitat and you could manage for them. And there was sufficient data for those prescriptions, but also management actions could have a reasonably positive response on the individuals, or they were representative of key forest types or characteristics. So we had kind of this range of considerations from the understory to the overstory, different habitat types, and different ecological and biological features. And I'm going to kind of zoom because I want to spend some time in the guide, but we broke our guide down into 4 forest associations with 7 subtypes. And within those, you can peruse your guide, and I actually encourage you to open it and take a tour. A better description, I think, is in Appendix B. It has some additional description on those forest types. But as we began to consider what birds, we wanted some birds that were representative of each. By far my wordiest slide, you'll have to forgive me, but it shows you how these subtypes break out. You know, some of the primary tree species, the Forestry for Minnesota birds, focal species, those in bold are on the Wildlife Action Plan species of greatest conservation need list. So half of our species you can find on that list as species of greatest conservation need. But notably, we've had species declines across, you know, even common forest generalists, not as much, but we included some of those too, especially when they were representative of key features like standing snags or down wood within the context of our forested landscapes. So as you pop through and as we go into our focal species, each one has its own like little page that describes its background, population status, whether or not it's a neotropical migrant or short distance migrant or stays in Minnesota all year. Community associates, I really like this one because it talks about the community of species you can also find in those habitats. And additionally, whether it's declining range wide, how it's doing in Minnesota, whether or not it's on the Wildlife Action Plan or Partners in Flight watch list, and what its vulnerability to climate change may be. And so if you take a gander down here into this, you'll see where it's located. Where it sings and forages is where the bird graphic will be, and where it nests is where the next graphic will be. Notably, it might spend some time in some of those other places because birds they tend to do that, and we box them in as much as we can to understand them better. But they might play in a few different sandboxes as well. So for each type, we tried to identify 3 to 4 species as best we could. And notable considerations, like I said, for habitat features. So upland conifer, we have 3 species for this one, Blackburnian warbler, magnolia warbler, and pine warbler. I'm going to spend a little bit of extra time because you can do a little of this on your own in our upland deciduous forest habitat. Before I get there, though, this has been a lowland conifer event today. And I just wanted to kind of showcase from a Connecticut warbler standpoint, the individuals that are in the forest, they're going to utilize different space for different parts of their life cycle. So you might find them foraging along the ground. They might nest in a little additional cover. So understanding when that's important. So Alexis and her team have used this many times. Messy forestry can be great forestry. We need consideration for large diameter trees, down coarse woody debris. Brush piles are okay. Sometimes that can be nest cover. If we're leaving, cutting, consider leaving trees that are examples of the previous overstory, dominant and co-dominant trees. If there happens to be some legacy trees that are larger diameter, we will want to consider leaving them as well. And that way we begin to create a landscape where we're not just looking at every bird species and what can I do for the golden wing? What can I do for scarlet tanager? Instead, we're starting to see where they appear in our habitats and understanding what they might be using, be it foraging along the forest floor or nesting on the forest floor, large diameter trees, cavity trees, where they might be utilizing different areas for forage. But not only that, like where the neighborhood habitat considerations might come into play. So you might have a site with golden wings singing in the top of a tree, but then we get to the point where they're going to move down and nest, and then we get to the point where they may move into the adjacent forest. So we want to understand how we can have dispersed retention for those species that need it, clumps that are residuals of the previous habitat and overstory. And additionally, some of those features like down coarse woody debris, large diameter trees that we can incorporate into our habitats so that we have like all of that going at one time. And that's a lot to consider. What do I do? It suddenly feels like so much detail. At the end of the day, the bottom line is if you're just leaving a few trees, a couple good clumps, especially in large sites that happen to be maybe greater than 20 or 30 acres in size, once that distance from edge is too far, having something that emulates that previous stand there is great because those species that like that edge can then use that. So where there's no coarse woody debris, sometimes you can see what isn't there. If there's no large coarse woody debris, consider leaving a little bit there. If there's no clumps of like brush or anything like that, consider leaving some brush piles. And even when you manage in these stands, there's going to be a few species in the guide that are a different habitat, like red-headed woodpecker. You may not be able to create habitat for here in northern Minnesota, and that's okay. So I really want to emphasize that there's no necessarily silver bullet every single time for these habitats. But if you look and you begin to see things in a holistic way, you can start to understand that, just by going down a checklist of diversity, you can begin to see different species showing up in these habitats. Are there conifer inclusions? Are we purely one type of species? Do we have some standing snags? What does the leaf litter look like? You might not be able to impact that, but it might help you understand if earthworms are an issue there. Do we have any water nearby? Do we have any riparian areas or wetlands that we could protect? What does the horizontal and vertical diversity look like? And the guide too, as you flip through it, has a habitat checklist that you can go through and begin to understand, and we'll work with them maybe a little bit later. But it has a few things, like even if you don't take this whole thing in there in the woods with you, which you can, it has little considerations that may just pop into your head. Am I seeing downwoody debris? Is it sparse, abundant at different diameter sizes? Are there standing snags? And if so, am I seeing enough, kind of 4 to 6 per acre? Are there any of that happen to be like 18 inches or greater, which is great for pileated, but also great for like fishers and martins? Are any of them alive? You know, because large cavity trees are really important as well. So are we seeing diversity in our habitats? And we really tried to be intentional to link how we design the guide and the habitat associations to incorporate considerations and align with the ecological classification system for the state of Minnesota. So it wasn't just like this brand new idea and how did it fit in exactly. You could use some of the same metrics and considerations, take a gander at the ecological classification system information about the habitat type that it mentions, and have that assist you as well. So it's really about a resource that can be used alongside the others in the state of Minnesota. And as we use them, we get to see if we add a couple additional features, some different species that we might be seeing in these habitats. And I think Josh Bednar put it to me best, or he said it at a something like this that we were at out in the field, where if you incorporate one, you know, for each one additional characteristic that you include in that list you saw before, the list that's here, you can expect to see 4 or 5 additional wildlife species utilizing those habitats. So the guide also has like descriptions of silvicultural systems, because it's for public and private use, or professional and private landowner use. So what does it mean to manage our forest in these different ways? And when we do, what tweaks can we incorporate in them? If we're clear cutting, can we do so with different systems that may retain a few additional trees? Maybe we can't do that everywhere. That's fine. A lot of woodland landowners are interested in how they can manage their forest for different wildlife. And a lot of foresters are interested in, well, when I'm out there, I can do this much, but how should I do it? What should I do? What does 5% mean? And how do I best utilize that 5% that I can retain to maximize the benefits for wildlife? Do I distribute it through the site? Do I add a couple trees? Do I make sure I have some large diameter trees and maybe some diverse species like softwood inclusions in aspen sites when maybe the site is not that diverse? So by incorporating those considerations, we can begin to bridge a gap between like management strictly for a resource to understanding the ecological processes that go into the forest composition as it exists today, and incorporating some of the disturbance ecology, some of the natural processes of the forest into our thought process as we're deciding how to create prescriptions. And we begin to see usage by more species. And so I'd want to be very intentional too, to say, like, that's just the beginning. There's a whole nother like story to be told about our guide, which is essentially like, take a gander at our appendices, because they are very impressive and very robust. So Appendix A, habitat feature descriptions. There's an additional dive in Appendix B into our forest habitat associations. There's considerations for climate change and like vulnerability, adaptability tables. And Appendix C is like a wonderland. It's like the nerd kingdom. So go there, click on the hot links and do a deep dive into so many different resources that are cost share programs, forestry assistance, more ecological and biological information, climate change information. It's really quite wonderful. And as one thing I forgot to mention about like the actual focal bird pop-outs is they often say like refer to Appendix C for more information. A lot of times in Appendix C, like a deeper dive into golden winged warbler and a number of other species, best management practices or conservation plans are all linked there in Appendix C. So I also want to shout out the Wisconsin initiative with my last couple of minutes. We are not a standalone program, as I mentioned before, and we're not the last either. Wisconsin is in the process of coming up with their guide, creating their working group. They already have a robust number of participants, and they're already a step ahead, perhaps, of Minnesota in some ways, because they have identified some of these demonstration sites that they want to utilize across the state. I also want to shout out the important bird areas that Audubon has identified, not just in Wisconsin, but Minnesota as well. And so if you're interested in joining the Wisconsin initiative, here's how you do it. Additionally, if in Minnesota you think you have some interesting areas that could be great demonstration sites for Forestry for Minnesota Birds practices, some of what you've seen here or see in the guide, please reach out to us. Because we would love to begin to incorporate that into our initiative so that we can bring more people out to see those sites. So yeah, if you want your name on this list, reach out. Same is really true in Minnesota. If you're looking to learn more, you can certainly reach out and contact me. I didn't have a QR code for it, but Michigan's guide is just a few years old now. It is also awesome, and you can find it here. You can Google up a recently completed guide in Oregon that the Forest Stewards Guild helped create. And so, or that you're the tip of the spear on that. And then additionally, we would not be here today, and these guides would not exist without the Upper Great Lakes Joint Venture, Upper Mississippi Great Lakes Joint Venture, and the Northern Forest Bird Network. So I really want to tip my cap to Jamie and the JV. Because you guys made it all happen.
The steering committee made it happen.
Well, yeah. So thank you very much.
Next up, we have Lane. He's going to give an overview of the Silvicultural Library.
Great, so I'm Lane Moser. I'm Extension Forester, Little E Extension Forester with the University of Minnesota Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative, working alongside Eli Sagor. We are at SFEC an educational cooperative. We have 51 member organizations, and so in my capacity there, we create and deliver custom educational content for foresters and natural resource managers throughout Minnesota and Western Wisconsin. And the Great Lakes Silvicultural Library represents one way in which we kind of deal in continuing education. And so this has all been teed up very nicely by a lot of the conversations and presentations here earlier, talking about communication, talking about the art of silviculture. And so we'll fold those pieces in, but again, thanks to the organizers and the presenters before me for making my job a little bit easier. Please, there we go. Great. Wow, yeah, that is washed out. There's a mostly transparent, I guess entirely transparent photo in the background, but just picture just like a gorgeous northern hardwood opening. There's some sedge, but it's okay because there's enough trees above it. So just for the next 20 odd minutes, I'll be talking kind of broader scale about some of the concepts and relevance, why the Silviculture Library exists, and really what it is for and what it does. And how it's relevant to folks like y'all in this room, regardless of who you work for or your profession. Then we'll get a chance to unpack this template, so we can just kind of sit on it for now, or if you want to tune me out earlier, then you can just start reading it. But we'll look at what goes really into a case study, how we can, in the course of folks' work, actually populate these case studies and limit that lift, that extra capacity, because we know it takes time to write case studies and fill these out. And then some ideas here with some of the potential applications, some of the uses for case studies, and then next steps and how to get involved. Great. All right. And so this is, again, like a birch forest, probably 25, 30 years old in the background. So just some takeaways here at the top of the presentation, right? So the Great Lakes Silvicultural Library facilitates knowledge exchange across organizational and administrative boundaries. Again, regardless of your profession, regardless of your work area, education, background, like this is a tool to help communicate and to help with knowledge exchange. I'll explain why I'm using knowledge exchange in a slide here. But case studies also empower resource managers to share their experiential knowledge and answer some of these management questions together, right? So it's about that collaboration and capturing that experiential knowledge. Well, I guess all these are happening at once. So how do natural resource managers typically gain or exchange information? So I say knowledge exchange, and it gets at kind of this idea of andragogy or adult education, thinking about how folks in this room are learning differently than if you have kids, how your kids learn. That's more of a knowledge transfer, right? They're being taught and they are learning how things work. But even in this case, if you don't know a whole lot about birds, all the presentations today are still being filtered through your own experiences. You're contextualizing what you're seeing with your actual on-the-ground experience. And so when I say exchange, it really implies this two-way street that occurs and is driven especially by the discussion at events like these, right? So conferences, tomorrow's field days or workshops where folks are putting on these events. They're providing sites, the managers are providing the sites and interpreting them, kind of giving folks some context. When people like me pester them for field sites and say, hey, we're trying to put on a workshop, do you have anything that's within this age class and in this forest type? Right. Managers might also participate be on the author team for articles or technical reports. They might provide the sites for the same. There might also be some exchange happening in these office meetings. So maybe this more internal, smaller scale. What should I do with this stand? Like, these are the constraints I have. What do you think? It was just with colleagues, kind of that really fine scale. And anecdotes are, whether they're shared at a fire or elsewhere, are kind of work into these at all of these layers, right? These breaks, folks have an opportunity to share some anecdotes, talk about their work in the hallways at conferences. You might be carpooling from site to site and talking about continuing that conversation from some of these field sites. And so those anecdotes are part of that as well, right? But by and large, though, like this is all relatively small scale, right? We can't go to conferences or workshops or all of that as our main job because folks are often actually managing the land, whether as loggers, foresters, wildlife folks, and everyone in between. And so this is capturing a very small percentage of the actual management that is occurring, but it's also a relatively small audience, right? Because we have 50 odd people here in this room. There's quite a few more folks that maybe, and 15 people online, maybe less. But I mean, think about the broader natural resource manager community. There's quite a few folks here. And so that aren't able to be here for a variety of reasons, but the scale is relatively limited. And so all that to say is I'm getting at kind of this continuum between this peer-reviewed literature on one end and anecdotes on the other. And so peer-reviewed literature, whether it's in the paper form, whether you're presenting on the findings from that paper at an event like this at a conference, whether you're presenting on those or providing those findings at a field tour, like going actually out to the study site, putting some pictures and context to the site described in the study. And so this peer-reviewed literature has a pretty high level of detail, right? There's a high level of detail, very rigorous, right? A pretty decent ability for other folks to be able to replicate that in their own work areas if they have the right forest types and other constraints there. But there is that ease of communication challenge, right? There's some barriers to communication. Again, thinking about how frequently folks might be able to present on this. Right? Most folks aren't going to be able to take their presentation and just do this speaker circuit for a single study and reach the broadest audience possible. This might be it for a given talk. And so then if that knowledge isn't being exchanged in other contexts, then how can it best be applied at the landscape level and get some of those takeaways into the hands of the managers that need them? Right. But on the other end of the spectrum, though, are anecdotes, and they don't have as much detail. When you're talking about a cool project you've worked on recently, you're not leading off with, well, this is the temperature and precipitation patterns from the nearest weather station. right? You kind of leave that part out when you're talking about the cool thing you did because you have to get your coffee and a pastry and get back in your seats, right? So the anecdotes don't have as much detail. They aren't repeatable with any level of confidence for someone. It can lead to more, right? You can start with a conversation that happens at this conference and then move to like, well, could you pass on the prescription document or the timber appraisal report or things like that? And now it goes further beyond that. But just that anecdote alone isn't necessarily sharing all of this, all of these takeaways, right? But that brevity also means that they're very easy to communicate. You can really have them anywhere, right? And so case studies operate here in the middle of this kind of continuum that I somewhat made up for this, just because they have this greater level of detail, but still not so much of a peer-reviewed study. They have some level of repeatability with some large asterisks and caveats, right? It's a foundation that you can base a treatment on without necessarily saying, I'm going to take this exact treatment the way you described it to me in this case study and do it in my work area, right? That might be an awkward conversation with a supervisor, but you can start with that treatment and then tweak it to what is relevant for your work area and go from there. And it gives you that foundation to build upon. Here we go. So with that foundation, that broader foundation of anecdotes and case studies and literature and knowledge exchange in mind, the Great Lakes Silvicultural Library is a resource by and for practitioners, right? It's designed with the idea that every silvicultural treatment is an experiment. It is comprised of these case studies. It captures this experiential on-the-ground knowledge of resource managers who have a very intimate knowledge and that place-based knowledge just built up over time by doing their job, right? And so talking about Peter talked about standing on the shoulders of giants. I mean, here again, like I'm a warm body that like gets to edit on the library, but we're standing on the shoulders of folks like Linda Nagel and Eli Sagor and Tony D'Amato, Kathleen Priest with the Forest Resources Partnership, who really got this off the ground. And so it's managed by SFEC, but these case studies are written up and submitted by resource managers. And so in that case, it really is driven by the practitioners and the questions that they have, the questions that they want answers to, but maybe can't find. So they go out and try to answer them themselves. The Great Lakes Silvicultural Library is an archive and a reference, right? Going back again to this place-based knowledge. If Jane the Forester starts working at a county and 30 years later retires from that county, like that is a profound amount of knowledge that they have built up over 30 years, over the time being in the woods, conversations with loggers, going to talks like this and applying it in their own context, like all of that knowledge, like that is a whole lot of info that they've just kind of built up, right? And that's this knowledge of the systems, the dynamics, the sort of the pieces that they have to factor in to make the right decision, given their own constraints, right? And so then if they retire and they don't share even a little bit of that knowledge and it's not captured in some other way, or it is captured, but it's in some filing cabinet that's locked and no one knows where the key is, and it's been in that office for 2 foresters now. Like I think we can all picture something quite like that. But archiving some of that, at least some of that information, like write some of this stuff down and don't just have it be some random prescription document that gets lost in a filing cabinet, but sharing that in some way. And the Silviculture Library is one example. There's the Wisconsin Silviculture Trials is another kind of similar case study library, but this is our resource. So I'm talking about the Great Lakes Silviculture Library. Another benefit here as a prescription reference, I mean, we've mentioned climate change, we're thinking about novel species compositions, we're thinking about different harvesting constraints that folks maybe not have had to deal with or are unfamiliar with in the past. I mean, thinking about, well, how far can I really kind of push this site if I'm not confident it's going to freeze every year? Like, is there some way that I can still get some management done to actually manage the forest without necessarily having impacts to regeneration? So that as a reference, people go to the library but looking to answer questions that they have. And there might not be guidance on some of these management guides, or they might be out of date or in these other novel situations. And zooming out a little bit, I'll kind of wax philosophically for a moment here. But the Silviculture Library is also a boundary object. And that gets at this idea that at multiple scales, we're essentially all, I think, especially in this room, folks working with multiple stakeholder groups are kind of operating on the boundaries between different groups and different organizations, right? So at the University of Minnesota's Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative, I have 1 foot in academia and 1 foot kind of in the practitioner realm, right? But then I also, in some cases, I'm on the boundary between the university and the county, or the university and the DNR, or other entities there, right? So that's what I mean when I'm thinking about boundaries. And so a lot of organizations, I think like ABC or Northern Forest Bird Network or others, it sounds like, I'm not familiar, but it sounds like it's a similar idea where you're pulling together stakeholders from a variety of backgrounds. And by operating on that boundary, then you can also facilitate some communication from there, right? You're kind of getting your foot in the door, starting that conversation. And case studies and the case study library is kind of this object that sits on the boundary, at times wholly separate from the University of Minnesota, because you can access case studies asynchronously. You don't even need to be in the same room with someone to be talking about some of these treatments that they're describing. And so in that case, it's just kind of this object that sits there, and it's connecting perhaps county foresters and DNR foresters, or county foresters and wildlife specialists who are trying to collaborate on something. And the U is wholly removed from that. It's just kind of there, and other folks are being able to take advantage of that. So when Marcella earlier was talking about, well, let's think about that communication. Let's think about, I think that example with the 5 harvesting blocks that all get cut at once. It's like, well, what are the neighbors doing? Well, shoot, like, how do we open the door to start some of that communication? And case studies can be one example of that. Great. So now we'll just kind of page through the review here. We're about halfway through. Folks online, you should just be able to type that Z link in. If you'd like to follow along, it'll just download. It's a link to download the template here. I'm holding it up for the owl, like it'll see. You'll figure it out. And so it seems like I think we'll be able to further unpack actual populated case studies later in the day. But just working through this template here, this is designed to kind of contain all the information that folks need, especially for first-time authors, to really get the ball rolling and think about how they can document their own work and the questions that they're hoping to answer here. So the stand information section, right? That's that context that is often missing from the sort of anecdotes that folks might share just in passing at a conference, at a fire over a tall beer or lemonade, excuse me. Right, thinking about some of the soils, some of that these site-specific pieces that are really the deciding factor, or play a disproportionate role perhaps in, like, well, could I try this treatment on my own land, right, in my own work area? Is this something that does this hold water, or is this just not relevant to me? In the case study body itself, the overview kind of acts as this abstract, or this short summary that folks can reference, see if it's relevant to them. We actually added, as part of kind of this idea of being nimble and thinking about ways we can support the people that use the Silviculture Library and contribute to it. We have this section on bottomland hardwoods, and so folks working in these really dynamic floodplain systems have an opportunity to, again, get more of that context, because just leaving that part out and thinking about some prescription or management that's occurring in a floodplain system, there's a lot of asterisks there if you're trying to replicate that treatment, because it depends on so many other pieces. The hydrology is a much bigger factor there compared to these upland sites, right? And certainly compared to even some of these lower forest sites. The silviculture objectives, again, and some of these pre-treatment conditions, so kind of the foundation that you're building off of, again, giving an idea beyond just, hey, I cut some quarter acre gaps into these northern hardwood stand in my work area, and I'm pretty pleased I'm getting like decent regeneration. It's like, well, say more. Like, it's not enough for me to take that and then say, oh, I should cut in quarter acre gaps in these, getting that full context for maybe why a treatment outcome is the way that it is in these pre-treatment things. The silviculture prescription about halfway through, and what actually happened. So this is really the meat of the case study. And through all of this, I don't think I mentioned this, but through all of this, right, this is going beyond just sharing a timber appraisal report, sharing a silviculture prescription, holding up this PDF and saying, yep, this is my prescription. You can copy it now and try to replicate it somewhere else. It's built off of that, but it also includes this opportunity for reflection. And there's a narrative as part of these case studies. It's not just kind of this clinical or sterile piece, but it's actually, you can follow the practitioner's kind of logic or train of thinking behind this. There's opportunities for the post-treatment assessment and assessment follow-ups. A lot of these treatments are driven by, are really the kind of at the regeneration harvest stage. And so there aren't as many opportunities for case studies now, and we're changing this. But it's not always capturing those sort of intermediate treatments, right? It's very regeneration focused, right or wrong. But there are opportunities, again, to kind of reflect on that. Plans for future treatments, getting back at this archive piece, thinking about, well, if sometimes I'll come back to foresters that submit an initial case study. I'll say, well, even if you don't have anything planned for this stand right now, what's typical for this stand, for this work area, based on your organizational constraints? Because you might think like, oh, well, this is just a kind of a regular thing that we do. It's like, well, maybe it's regular for you, but if the landowner, if you're working for Aitkin DNR and Aitkin County is doing something completely different, I mean, you're in the same area, but you might have different approaches to tackling these problems. And so that's the art of silviculture that Marcella talked about too, right? Because each manager is going to approach these challenges differently. They're going to tackle these management questions in their own ways and in unique ways. And so getting at that thought process behind it is where really the value of these case studies lie. And some pieces for some of the economic considerations and the summary, again, to kind of close out some of these thoughts. But in the supplemental content, there will also be options if folks have additional data. Again, maybe not as robust as Appendixes A, B, and C in the Forestry for Minnesota Birds Guide, but at least that further context or things that might be of interest to folks to really give them, again, boiling down to just that extra information to see if managers are able to capture that treatment and apply it in their own work area. We do also collect author information as part of the case study. Folks can provide as much as they would like. We do hope that it builds relationships and leads to folks reaching out and saying, hey, I tried this treatment and I tweaked it this way. Like, do you have any advice? Or like, I'm stuck here. Like, I don't know how to take what you did and apply it to my conditions, which might be a bit more nebulous, or I have some question marks there, or some other operational constraints or things like that. We don't have a way of tracking that other than anecdotes, and it like makes my month when I hear about them. But that's also, I guess, partly because they're few and far between. If you do end up making connections, just shoot me an email, and I will be happy. But that's about it. Yeah.
So during planning of this conference, we were looking at the lowland conifer sites in the Silvicultural Library, and we ended up calling someone who was putting them in.
Yes.
They're no longer with the DNR, but I know you called, what was her name?
Yeah, she's still with the DNR, she's just down in Preston.
Yeah, it's a different habitat.
Southern.
Nice.
Yeah, so we,
The upland hardwood site also comes
Yeah.
from the library, and actually print out literally here. So like, even if you have like one site, oh man, it's some interesting stuff here and has some outcomes, like start with one. There's not a ton of information. My guess is you have a lot of that already in your stand prescription documents. And incorporating that into the silviculture. It's a resource that I think believe strongly needs to be useful.
And it hits differently when he says it, because if I say it, it's like, well, no shit, dude, you manage it. But like when Peter says it, there we go. So other folks, lots of people are saying like, use the silviculture library. And on this last part, so just closing out the template, then we'll keep her moving here. We have a list of some of the forest health threats and site preparation methods. And this gets at, I think I got all the site preparation methods. Maybe there's some terminology or jargon differences, but also, again, getting at some of the uniqueness that comes from these different sites, and especially when you're looking at different soil types and the variability associated with that. We are thinking about expanding our forest health threats, but we're just not quite sure. We don't want to have kind of a lake a mile wide and an inch deep, but folks will be able to then filter by some of these forest health threats. If you have questions about, well, what should I do with heterobasidian root rot, then you can click on case studies. Maybe that wasn't a good example. I think we only have 0 to 1 case studies. But again, so think about forest health threats as some of these uses. That's kind of a segue here into some of the applications for case studies. Specifically, I think on maybe an obvious one here is as a basis for workshops and field days. Again, when I think about workshops or these, like really telling a story through field site visits, where the site is neat, it's great to have a good site that kind of has the things that you're looking for as kind of these discussion points or leaping off points. But it's really just kind of a vessel for the conversations that happen because of it. Like it's a backdrop. It's much more fun to talk about forestry and silviculture and wildlife management, all these other pieces in the woods, right? Like rather than here in a indoors. But we can use case studies to kind of structure those field days. Again, getting at that narrative, that art that's occurring. This picture is from a workshop that we put on in the Driftless region. All three sites, we kind of looked at the kind of the beginning, middle, and end, the regeneration, tending, and regeneration harvest stages of these, some of these oak or black walnut stands in the southeast. And again, it was just taking snippets from case studies and going from there. Another application is a tool for, as a tool for communication. And I use this a little bit. I put a distinction here between workshops. Of course, for workshops, you're also thinking about communicating some ideas. Folks have questions about forest management and you want to convey those in a workshop format. But when we're thinking about communication, I mean, another kind of phrase for the slide could just be managing expectations, right? If even with our high quality cameras now on our phones, right, it can be helpful to have someone interpret a wall of green, or if you're interacting, like whether you're a logger or a consulting forester interacting with the members of the public for their own land, you can hold up a case study and say like, well, this is what it's going to look like. Like this is, when I say a small gap, this is what I mean here. And we can see some of that structure. You can even point to the conditions on the ground and say like, well, yes, I guess this doesn't maybe look to the untrained eye as pristine as some of these other forests, but like, well, we can point to the regeneration and say like, we're emulating disturbances that are pretty catastrophic, even at this finest scale of tip-ups. I mean, if we think about what's actually happening there, like that's pretty darn catastrophic. It doesn't look pretty, but we're worried about, are we getting enough regeneration? And you can point to these case studies, use them as examples to manage expectations and demonstrate some of these concepts or partnerships and be able to say, yes, this is what it's going to look like, or what it could look like, or this is why we're doing it. There's some reasoning behind it, support it with data, go beyond just trust me, or I've been doing this for a while. And lastly, and I left this towards the end because I really wanted to kind of close on this idea of experimentation as one application. I think about case studies as being relatively more nimble in answering some questions with regards to forest health or novel species compositions compared to the peer-reviewed literature, because managers might not be able to wait until a study can be developed and analyzed and published to have some of these questions. And so case studies can be a stopgap in the form of when dealing with forest health threats or some of these other pieces, and get some management done now while giving those studies time to catch up, again, to get that more robust guidance, right? Want to be clear, we're not disparaging the academic literature or things like that, but rather if you need to make decisions and you have questions about, well, what should I do here? What should I do if there hasn't been oak wilt in my area in the past, and now it's coming up here in sandstone or further west up the Anoka sand plain? Like, how do I tackle this? If it isn't in the management guide, write it down and put one answer to the question that you have, document that on a case study. Right, and for these novel stand compositions, if they're comprised of species where we know how they act or how they some of the dynamics in Kentucky, but we're moving them a little bit further north now, and how does that factor into what we have here now? And lastly, again, with these forest health threats, just thinking about ways in which you're able to answer some of those questions that you have and get at how you can keep some of these stands forested, meet your objectives, whatever they may be, while still kind of on the forester side or the manager side, still having some agency over what you're doing and thinking like, well, I'm at least doing something. This is a foundation. I could sell this to my supervisor who could get behind it. It isn't just me saying, oh, I think this could work, but you could point to a case study and say, Like, it's not nothing. We can tweak this for our work area, make it work, and write down the results. Because even if we're not, even if it's a surprise, right, or a regeneration failure, right, it's a surprise, and you can still learn from that and document it. And that's one of the challenges as we're getting into how folks can get involved. One of the challenges is that I think most resource managers are frustratingly humble, and they just kind of say like, well, I don't know if my stuff is like, well, I don't know if it's even worth posting. It's like, well, pause, because there's so much like with that humility, like there's so much of this idea of like, well, if I have limited time to put a case study, it better be something that's super novel, like really exciting, tip of the spear type stuff. But there's also value to have that business as usual stuff, especially if we're thinking about folks like the feds, the Forest Service, who are moving around as part of their career advancement generally, right? If someone is moving from Oregon to a new GS11 position here in Minnesota, business as usual would be pretty nice to get an idea for, well, what's typical here? I'm used to managing Doug fir. What do I do with these red pine systems? And that's where that business as usual can be helpful too, both as an archive, as a reference, thinking about ways that this can be applied in a variety of different contexts. So there's the link there to the Silviculture Library if folks are interested. There's kind of two workflows. The first, if you're unsure about if a case study is, if a treatment is case study material, you can fill out a form and I'll get some basic information, the treatment, just kind of a broad overview before folks fill out the case study template and get an idea of whether it's a good fit for the library. But then after that, it's just populating a Word document. And a lot of the work has already been done when you wrote the prescription, when you described the treatment to some of your colleagues, when you're writing it up as part of some other report. A lot of this heavy lifting for the writing has already been done. So again, some of these takeaways here, and full disclosure, I duplicated the picture. So it's the same 25, 30-year-old birch stand from before. But so some of these takeaways here is that it's, again, that knowledge exchange. We're hearing a lot about this landscape level management, how we can't just kind of manage in a vacuum. You have to be thinking about what the neighbors are doing. And case study libraries is one way for folks to get a better look at kind of what the neighbors are up to with regards to adjacent landowners. And also thinking about ways that managers can kind of feel empowered and actually answer some of the questions that they have and use those as those conversation starters, communicate ideas among colleagues as well as the general public and others. So thank you all.
Dale Gentry from Audubon.
All right, fun to be here. This is going to be a case study more about anticipated management than it is about specific on the ground work. So I'll try and provide a little context to exactly what that means. Here we go. Again, my name is Dale Gentry. I'm the Director of Conservation for Audubon up in Mississippi River. And we do work across Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, uplands, bottomlands, but this work is specifically about our work on the Mississippi River and the hardwood bottomland forests that are so important to breeding and migratory birds in that region. And I'd say maybe a little bit less so in Minnesota, but especially in certain stretches of the river, that is the only big patch of contiguous deciduous forest habitat there is, right? So especially for migratory birds, these can be incredibly important as stopover sites, but also contain a unique community of breeding birds. And interestingly, our forests, despite sort of the climate patterns that are calling for warmer and wetter conditions that should be great for supporting deciduous forest habitat, these are unique situations which are losing deciduous forest. And mostly, as Lane alluded to, some of you might have picked up on, because of some unique hydrology, right? We have taken the river, which was historically a very dynamic system, and tried to control it as much as possible by installing a series of 26 locks and dams between Minneapolis and St. Louis, which has turned the river into a series of lakes or pools, as we call them. And that process has led to the loss of a lot of the dynamic nature of the system, lost a lot of the bottomland forests in the 1930s after we installed those locks and dams. More recently, what appears to be climate-driven changes in precipitation has led to even more. And so in the bottom left corner, that's my little box to highlight that we're losing forest across basically every metric that we can measure it in that stretch from St. Louis to Minneapolis, which these data come from the Upper Mississippi River Restoration Program, right? So this pattern is starting to show up in the public's interest as well for people that recreate on the river. They're like, why are all these trees dying? What's going on? And what, if anything, can we do about it? And these forests are really interesting for a number of reasons in that they are arguably among the forests that get the least attention from people that are trying to harvest trees. These forests are managed almost entirely for wildlife benefit. If we go back decades, we'd find that people were trying to harvest trees off the Mississippi River, but nowadays it's all managed for wildlife, and yet we still struggle to accomplish that goal because, again, the forests are struggling to persist, mostly because of excess water on the system. Some of you might recall the flood of 2019, during which many of these forests were inundated for 2 solid months plus. And that's just too long for many of these, even these flood tolerant trees to thrive. So Audubon, along with our partners that are managing the river, which are mostly the state DNRs, plus the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Army Corps of Engineers, are developing plans on how to manage these floodplain forests. And one of the big questions that exists is, well, what are the species we want to manage for? In many cases, it's birds and bats and amphibians and things. But for the species we do want to manage for, what should we create? You know, what's the best case scenario? What are the habitats they need for cerulean warbirds, for prothonotary, for red-shouldered hawks, et cetera? And we didn't have the baseline data about the habitat conditions that were desirable. And so the Army Corps and Audubon developed this Forest Avian Stewardship Plan. And the first line in that plan was identify the habitat needs of the species of concern so that we can try and create those habitats where those opportunities exist. So this is a part of, again, this lots of partnerships designed to manage these forests for wildlife, because their use for forest products is really long in the past. So Audubon has been working with that group to implement that Forest Avian Stewardship Plan for almost 15 years now. And the goal, again, is just to establish a monitoring program so that we can understand the species composition, the bird community, understand their habitat needs, model their populations, model their distributions. All of this information then can go together into providing guidance in how we ought to manage the river going forward in the bottomland forests there. So starting in 2011, we started doing forest monitoring down in the St. Louis district in pools 24, 25, and 26. We expanded that work later with support from the joint venture, and again with support from LCCMR, to collect enough data across enough of the river to be able to accomplish all those goals of understanding the community, modeling habitat needs, modeling distributions, et cetera. So, and I apologize, I'm kind of zipping through some of this, right? 10 minutes is brief. So instead of cutting out slides, I just said, we'll just turn up the speed. So real quickly, just to simplify, we did 10-minute point counts. This has been our practice long-term, especially because we wanted to model density and population trends. Although going forward, we're really looking probably at using ARUs for future monitoring. That's kind of an actively evolving process. But 10-minute point counts across over, gosh, I can't even remember how many different points independent points we've monitored, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 different points across the Upper Mississippi River system. So we have a series of 9 focal species that we are using to identify some of which are rare species that we're trying to manage for and understand their habitat needs, and others are more established and regular and common species that we think are indicative of the habitat needs of some of the others. And so for these 9 species, we hope to have enough data to model all their populations and habitat needs. And what we found was that some of them are, even though species of greatest conservation need and thought to be associated with bottomland forests, we didn't get enough data to even model all of them. And so this is where part of the reason we're switching to ARUs, in part because of the unique conditions of cerulean warblers and their unique habits of being early to breed and late and early to stop calling. And so with our monitoring that started on June 1st, we started to realize that we were just missing birds that probably were present, because by the time they have a nest and eggs, they stop singing on their territories, unlike most of the rest of their compatriots. And so we think that there are birds there that we're missing in some cases. But overall, we did find that these collection of 9 focal species gave us a good indicator of what's going on in the river. And I'm just going to provide a few sort of interesting takeaways and highlights that ultimately, and we talked about our goal of developing a bottomland forest for birds manual, very much in the same vein as the manual we use for statewide. But this is going to be for specifically to the Upper Mississippi River, working from St. Louis all the way down to Cairo, Illinois, with the confluence of the Ohio River, so a different geography. But just a couple interesting notes in a few species that we found interesting patterns with. American redstarts, if you model their populations across Minnesota and Wisconsin, populations are generally increasing, but in the bottomland forest, their populations are decreasing. Could be that's just a function of their habitat decreasing, but it's interesting that their regional populations within that habitat isn't modeling or isn't following the patterns that we're seeing across the region. And then we start to see interesting patterns also geographically here. We see, for example, that in the upper stretch of the river, Minnesota and Wisconsin, they are at much higher density than they are in the lower stretches of the river, which can be explained. We'll see that similar pattern in other species like the indigo bunting. Indigo bunting, common bird in Minnesota and Wisconsin, common bird in the bottomland forests down in Missouri and Illinois. But then you get into the bottomland forests in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and they suddenly become relatively scarce. So lower populations, but growing populations in Minnesota and Wisconsin. That's that bottom green line. Oh gosh, you can't really see the trend lines around that, but there are sort of confidence levels around each of those lines, but we're kind of washed out. But in the upper river, populations much more abundant, but then declining in the lower part of the river, which is in the upper lines, populations are larger but declining. And in the upper part of the river, Minnesota and Wisconsin, populations are less dense but growing. So interesting patterns there. And then we have a species like Prothonotary warbler, who are abundant across the entire river. I know that that's an exciting rare bird to see in some parts of the state. If you get down to the far extreme southeastern corners in the Mississippi River, they are not rare and exciting. You get 2 to 3 birds at every single point. They're abundant, but they're declining across all pools from 1 down to 26. And so a population of concern for many reasons. So here's just kind of a general summary of some of what we're seeing is that almost all species are either stable or declining, with the exception of red-headed woodpecker, which was increasing, but only in the southern stretch of the river down in Missouri and Illinois region. So pattern that likely is following the loss of bottomland forests, but it might also be reflecting regional patterns in some cases, although a few exceptions there, like with the redstart and indigo bunting, where the patterns in the bottomland forests are not following the regional patterns. And so we're trying to tease some of those things out. As I mentioned, one of the goals, the reason we're doing this work is so we can model habitat associations, so we can tell the Army Corps and Fish and Wildlife, these are the types of forests that we want to produce. And so we did, for most species, get enough data to model their specific habitat needs and conditions that they're selecting for. Forgot to mention that all of the point count sites are co-located within 100 meters of Army Corps forest inventory plots so that we can look at habitat conditions. And so we've got, again, these data that we'll use then to translate into rough, a little bit more easy to understand habitat conditions that will go into the Bottomland Forest for Birds Manual. And again, we've got these for all the species of interest, but I'm just showing what we've got for, those are prothonotary warbler. As I mentioned, we also modeled population or a spatial prioritization for habitat conditions of higher and lower value. And we see some interesting trends there where the driftless region of Minnesota and Wisconsin and Northeast Iowa really shows up as very important for these types of habitats. We can narrow this down also into just the specific river reaches if we want. And again, sort of like the map that Peter showed earlier, this is specific to forest birds. So, there are birds in Western Minnesota, but just not that many forest birds. But ultimately here, there are 10 plus years of data collected from the Mississippi River bottomlands to inform all of the land managers in the region can now be translated into forest conditions, desired forest conditions for species of greatest conservation interest to those different agencies. And this work is important because in many cases, these populations are declining and have regional patterns also that are noteworthy. And so the ultimate goal, what we started with 14 years ago, we're finally coming to fruition, where we're in the process of developing a guidebook for this region from roughly the Twin Cities region at Lock and Dam number 1 down to the confluence with the Ohio River at Cairo, Illinois, to guide the state and federal agencies on how to manage these forests for birds. And so this is an active project. We're about halfway through it. If any of you are interested, involved in bottomland forests, want to take part, and this is the first you're hearing of it, don't hesitate to contact me, and we can add you to the group that's involved in development of these resources. But yeah, an exciting program that we're excited to finally be able to help manage for birds in these habitats. So I hope maybe I did for two.
It's hard, I know. All right, next is Golden Wing. With Peter and Steven.
I'll talk really fast.
No worries, remember that's a little bumper at the end here.
Yeah.
How's that?
Good. So I just wanted to give you first a quick look at, how it'll be represented in the guide. The guide itself has Appendix C that will lead you to being able to find the Golden Wing Warbler Best Management Practices Conservation Plan, which was put together by a consortium of natural resource professionals. And so we'll just dive right into it because we have limited time. So.
Yeah, so most people have probably heard of Golden Wing Warblers, but we want to put this up there just to show the context of that regional or the species range decline on the East Coast there, but the population trend is declining on the East Coast, but in Minnesota it's relatively stable or increasing, and just the regional importance of that to this species.
Some really notable takeaways here is a decline somewhat close to us. What do these large circles indicate?
So the larger the circle is the higher percentage of or the relative percentage of the population.
So declining kind of almost in our backyard, even though Minnesota was indicated as being stable population wise. So really goes to show that Minnesota is an Alamo for the species. 10 to 12% of the land area houses about 45% of the remaining breeding population each year.
Yeah, that just is shown again through some of our, this is our forest bird trends for golden wing warbler on the left side, generally stable and increasing. And that's in the center there is a relative abundance map. And then on the right is the breeding bird atlas, and just showing relative abundance of breeding pairs and just how significant this region is for this species.
It tends to be a deciduous forest species. Once the percentage gets too high, it's going to find somewhere else. I'll get to that in a second, but we're really emulating natural disturbance when we're out there trying to do the work. A lot building off of what I spoke about before. We're trying to utilize those ecological processes, those natural disturbance regimes to help create prescriptions for the work. We can do that in a few different ways. Mechanical is usually what's done in our deciduous forest setting, creating those prescriptions, being intentional about retaining that internal structure. But things like tree planting, prescribed fire are really important disturbance processes as well. Taking a look at the landscape level, we're looking within about a mile, making sure that there's deciduous forest that doesn't exceed about 30%. We want some early successional habitat patches in the area because the bird has a high site fidelity. So returning to within about a mile to a mile and a half of where it is nested in the past. As we drill down into the site, deciduous forest at about 20 to 30% at that point, a little bit more deciduous forest base. There's a few different ways to do the shrubland management. We can rotate that management in sort of a grid pattern in 20 to 25% blocks. I found that to get the most work done across the landscape, I was just creating a dynamic mosaic within the areas with a high level of retention in the interior, about 25 to 50%. As you got closer to the edge, I was feathering into that forest edge as much as I could. Consider leaving these little open patches, maybe for American woodcock singing grounds, about a half acre, even a quarter acre or more will often get used, but a half acre or more is ideal. And so adjacent forest structure, more mature forest adjacent to it, they will utilize that for the next stage of their life cycle. So they'll actually abandon these young forest openings and go into the adjacent mature forest edge. We'll talk a little bit about fledgling cover in a second, but the same is true in a mature forest setting. We're looking to leave 10 to 15 trees per acre. Those voluntary site level guidelines guide towards I think 6 to 12. So hitting the high end of that, even those few extra trees, making sure they're dominant and co-dominant, 9 to 10 inches or greater DBH, really makes a dramatic difference for not just golden wings, but a number of different species that utilize those sites. And then you can see as we manage these sites, the effect on the back end is really incredible. They're super diverse. They're utilized by a range of different species, and we're intentional about retaining some of those other features like standing snags within the context of our sites as well. So there was some monitoring done 2015 through 18. With incredible effects for golden wing warblers, relative abundance almost doubled up to about 2.5 individuals per hectare, I believe. The same, our occupation rates, especially on the shrublands, which I worked on primarily, exceeded 90%, which was pretty incredible as well. This is a subset of sites. Those same sites, were a few in Wisconsin as well. That woodcock singing ground surveys were done. Again, the rate of utilization, especially in the shrublands, was extremely high, but it was in the deciduous forest also. So we're seeing densities, between 0.75 for our timber harvest up to 1.25 for brushland sites per hectare, which is really incredible. And that's just with a little bit of intentional retention of dynamic structure.
Yeah, so I was going to talk a little bit about the nest fledgling and monitoring that we've done at NRRI. Our goal was looking at nest success and fledgling success and movement between young forest and shrub wetlands. Found 125 nests, and it's around 36%. There was no significant difference in nest success between the two habitat types, and we tagged 126 nestlings and tracked them daily for daily survival and GPS locations to use for habitat. analysis down the road there. Nest predation was the leading cause of nest failure, 66% of failed nests and almost half of all nest outcomes. We started using trail cameras to document nest predators in the last few years of this project, and we have a few of those. There is some volume, so hopefully it's not too loud, but
It doesn't look like they're moving like they were forever. Oh, there they go. You see that golden one fighting off the snake?
that was kind of fun.
To see.
So the birds that made it out of the nest, we track those daily, as I mentioned. We use those fledgling points that we tracked tied with max daily movement. So the max distance that a bird traveled from the previous day per age was tied to those points to create a buffer. So basically, the older the bird gets, the bigger the buffer gets. And we looked at the habitat available in those buffers compared to what they use. So what they use is in the blue, and then what was available is in the red. And they tended to select the habitat that they were nesting in over other habitats. So basically, shrub wetland birds that nest in shrub wetlands stay in nest geez Louise. Stayed in shrub wetlands and young forest birds.
It's an interesting story because they tend to utilize similar protective habitats. They like that kind of thicker stuff once they've fledged and they'll bounce around in it. But they tend to, if they were born in young forest openings, use young forest cover for protection. And the same is true with those shrub wetlands. So if you're managing in the shrubland areas, leaving a few patches for that residual protection can be really important. It probably speaks to how site occupation and nest success really starts to peak around year 3, 4, once that regeneration takes place and there's a little more cover.
Yeah, so the fledgling consistently chose microhabitats with higher subcanopy cover, increased stem density, and more coarse woody debris. And the subcanopy cover was correlated with a higher daily survival rate. And then additionally, the daily survival rate increased significantly after the first 7 days, or basically once those birds got older than 7 days. That first window is kind of the most vulnerable point for those birds. And so I think talking about how trying to keep that structural integrity and structural diversity throughout the site is important, especially right around the nesting.
So we have to be done. But the key takeaway, this doesn't look that dramatic, but if we're talking, let's say 3 to 5% or so, probably more like 3%, but 3% per day, you know, if you change from 90% to almost 95%, let's say fledgling survival, that 5% carried over a week to 10 days, all of a sudden results in a dramatic amount of additional fledgling survival. So it doesn't look like much when you put it up here, but when you start to think about it in that way, it really points to how important that post-fledge habitat is to the survival of the chick.
Thank you.
So with the Hunter Walking Trail project, just briefly, we're doing a lot of small, frequent harvests along these Hunter Walking Trails. Couple reasons to improve breeding bird diversity along these systems. We have 600 miles of Hunter Walking Trails here in Minnesota. So we can create more opportunities for not just our hunters in the state here, but we've got a lot of up and coming folks that are getting into bird watching and maybe hopefully improving opportunities for those as well. A few things I'll say here. So this project is done in partnership with RGS. So some of our sites in the Chippewa are administered by RGS, and through that, they're working through the stewardship program there, where the funds from those timber sales are used to improve like some of the Hunter Walking Trails signs, do culvert replacements and things like that. And then I'll transfer it to Reid.
Thanks, Josh. Hi, everyone. I'm Reid Siebers. I'm yet another member of the NRI Bird Lab. Hopefully you're not too sick of us yet, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this project. Josh kind broadly talked about it, but just to give you a little more background. In the Chippewa National Forest, they're currently conducting a long-term habitat improvement project by implementing these small-scale frequent harvests along existing hunter walking trails. These sites are harvested in 5-year intervals, primarily consist of aspen clear cuts or spruce fir thinnings, and are less than 5 acres. And the goal of this effort is to create and maintain a matrix of multiple forest age classes along these trails that are suitable for game species, especially ruffed grouse and American woodcock, but also supporting diverse non-game breeding bird communities. So back in 2020, we designed the Hunter Walking Trail project to assess ruffed grouse abundance and also characterize breeding bird communities both before and after these small-scale frequent harvests are implemented in the chip. And we utilize 2 different methods to survey these birds. I'll get into those in a second. But first, I just wanted to show you our study area. We currently conduct these surveys along 8 hunter walking trails in the Chippewa National Forest. Those top 4 we call our original core areas. We've been surveying those every year since 2020. But in 2023, we did add 4 additional hunter walking trails, 3 of which act as controls with a range of traditional harvest intensity. Here are those same 4 core areas during each of our past 5 survey years. I'm sorry, that's pretty hard to see, but trust me, you can see the little stands that have been harvested in there somewhere. The red lines represent when the first round of harvests have occurred, and I guess it's kind of like a light yellowish color on the stands that have been harvested at this point. So currently we have 5 years of data, 2 to 3 years of pre-harvest, 2 to 3 years of post-harvest. Our 2025 data has been collected, currently in the process of entering and analyzing that, but that'll be in our report coming at the end of the year. So soon to be 6 years worth of data. And on to our 2 survey methods. Our first is line transect surveys. Pretty fun to conduct. A lot of my crew's tasks during the summer are completing point counts that require a lot of bushwhacking into the woods. So these being on trails is kind of a nice day off for us, I guess you could say. So our trained observers will walk the entirety of a hunter walking trail in the morning at a pace of 100 meters every 6 minutes and record on a data sheet or an iPad every single bird that we identified by sight or by sound. And we do this twice per year, once in the springtime to take a look at ruffed grouse abundance, and once in the summertime to try to characterize these breeding bird communities. And our second survey method is the use of ARUs. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with these. We have 24 that we deploy throughout our sites during our spring transect surveys, and we grab them while we're doing our summer surveys. They're programmed to record an hour of audio at sunrise and an hour at sunset. And we currently use these audio files to analyze grouse and woodcock, potentially other forest breeding songbirds or even amphibians in the future. So here's some kind of raw data, I guess, on grouse and woodcock from our spring walking transect surveys. Just by glancing at this quick in response to the harvest, seen there as the dotted lines in red, it seems like both grouse and woodcock are responding well to the cuts. Tied for a high for ruffed grouse observed in 2024 and a high for woodcock in 2024, which is a great sign. Now on to the summer transect surveys, looking at the breeding bird communities. Looks like generally both the average number of individual birds that we're detecting on these surveys and the total species that we're detecting are trending upwards post-harvest, which is very, very encouraging. That map in the top right kind of looks like just a cluster of nonsense, but that's every bird that we've recorded on one of our hunter walking trails, the Morph Meadows Trail, during the 5 years of this study. So a lot of very valuable data that we can start dissecting now that we're a few years post-harvest. Continuing with those summer transect surveys, this is a few species of interest and how they've responded so far to this harvesting method. Those top 3, ovenbird, red-eyed vireo, and wood thrush, are commonly associated with mature forests. You can see there's kind of a range of what's happening there. Ovenbird and red-eyed vireo are showing stable and increasing trends respectively post-harvest, which is something we certainly didn't expect when planning this project. There are, however, many examples of mature forest species that have seen declines since the harvest occurred, such as scarlet tanager, brown creeper, and wood thrush. These species are more associated with large tracts of undisturbed mature forest, but that being said, it's really promising that we're still detecting these species on these surveys. So they're declining, but they're not being completely displaced, which is great. Below that are some species of conservation concern. See veery, least flycatcher, and golden-winged warbler all have been increasing post-harvest, especially golden-winged warbler. You see 122% increase is skyrocketing post-harvest, which is especially important because, as Stephen and Peter just said, golden wings require this diverse matrix of forest age. So it does seem like the golden wings are kind of funneling into these newly made habitats. And that's a trend that we're seeing among many early successional associates as well. Now briefly onto those ARU results. Just in 2024, we detected drumming grouse, unsurprisingly, in all 8 project areas and on every single day that ARUs were recording. And we had over 8,500 total grouse drums. But when looking at overall trends this early into the study, there's quite a lot of variation, honestly, by year and by site. However, this is meant to be a long-term project. So as we continue to collect more and more data, we'll be able to separate out the effect that these small-scale cuts are having on the grouse versus inherent population fluctuations of ruffed grouse. And finally, American woodcock. In 2020 and 2021, which were both pre-harvest years, we only detected woodcock on 1 ARU. However, after the harvests were implemented, woodcock detections went way up. You can see of our 24 ARUs, 18 detected woodcock in 2024. And of the 13 ARUs that were deployed within these small harvested stands, 11 of them had woodcock detections. So it does really seem from both our ARUs and our transect surveys that woodcock are responding really well to these small cuts, which isn't too surprising. And just to wrap up quick here, when we are comparing these unique small scale cuts versus a traditional clear cut, we're seeing a lot of benefits so far. We're seeing bird diversity improvements as new communities are able to thrive in and around these harvested stands without completely displacing existing communities. The small cuts also do a good job of mimicking small natural disturbances and create a lot of edge, which benefits many birds, especially we're seeing early successional associates. And by conducting this type of harvest, we'll also be able to meet our economic goals and needs without causing as much ecological disruption. And actually, what we're seeing is help diversify these communities and maybe make them more resilient. And there's a lot more exciting data to come. Like I said, we've already collected data during our 2025 field season. We have funding for next year as well. We hope to continue this as long as possible. We have our next round of harvesting coming up in a couple years, so that'll add another interesting layer to this project. So yeah, we hope it'll continue well into the future, and we'll keep on collecting data. So with that, thank you to our partners, thank you to Bird Lab, thank you to those of you in this room that have worked on this project, and that's it.
I'm Emilia, and today I'll be talking about the bird community in a burned versus unburned oak irregular Shelterwood site, 15 to 16 years post-harvest in central Wisconsin. So to start off with some background, about 1 billion forest birds have been lost in North America since 1970, as we've heard a couple times today. Also, from the most recent State of the Birds report, for eastern forest bird species, disturbance-dependent species have had the most widespread declines. Prescribed fire and tree harvest can be used to create habitat for these species. The other side of this is that there's been a decrease in oak, and this is due to less regeneration and recruitment, as well as an increase in competing species like red maple. And some reasons for this are forest mesification and a lack of prescribed fire. Songbirds migrate to Wisconsin for seasonal insect abundance, and oaks support high insect diversity. Additionally, some birds will preferentially nest in oak, so these habitats are important for a number of different bird species. Prescribed fire is one tool that can be used to promote oak, and this is because it's fire adapted. So some ways in which it benefits from fire is increased mineral soil contact for acorns, as well as opening up the understory and decreasing competing species. Irregular shelterwood is another method that can be used to promote oak. And this is like a shelterwood, but where you vary your harvests over space and time. And this increases the structural diversity in a stand and also promotes diverse age classes of trees. And this increase in structural diversity and age class diversity can lead to an increase in bird species. So jumping into how we did our research, we did point count neon protocols. So that's National Ecological Observatory Network protocols. And we also did vegetation surveys at each of our bird survey points. So we collected basal area live and snag and canopy cover using both spherical densiometer and percent visual estimates. We also collected invasive percent cover and modified robopole data, and that was within height categories of 1 to 7 feet because a lot of birds will use vegetation within that height group. This is a map of where our study sites were located in Wisconsin. So for the irregular shelterwood part of these sites, they were both harvested 15 to 16 years prior to us going in and collecting this data. Both sites had sandy, droughty, nutrient-poor soils, so great to get oak on. It was mostly northern pin and black oak, along with associates of aspen, red maple, white and red pine, and white and bur oak. These sites were set up to have varied crown cover retention at time of harvest. So each site had plots that had 0, 15, 30, and 45% retained crown cover. So because retained crown cover varied throughout the site, as a whole, each site is an irregular shelterwood. This is an image of part of the site a few years post-harvest. So preferentially reserved trees were white oak, bur oak, and white pine. And this is another example a few years post-harvest, where some areas were completely open with no reserve trees. This is a top-down view of the two sites, so they're in similar habitat in a similar area. Again, they were both harvested at the same time window, but then the Greenwood West site up top was also prescribed burned on May 6, 2024. We then went in and collected bird data within 24 to 39 days post-burn and collected vegetation data within 30 to 58 days post-burn. We then calculated bird abundance and diversity metrics and compared those metrics to 2 prior years of data that we had for these sites where neither was burned, and then created and assessed models that had fire and vegetation metrics as predictors for bird metrics. Getting into our findings, we found that bird abundance, species richness, and Shannon diversity index were the highest in the burned site, both within the year that one site was burned, but also comparing that site to itself across time for the 2 years it wasn't burned in. We also found that the burned site had higher functional richness, a higher abundance of open woodlands birds, shrub and tree nesters, ground foragers and flycatchers, and omnivore insectivore birds, and a lower abundance of ground nesting birds. For bird abundance, the most important predictor variables were live basal area, fire, and canopy overstory. For bird richness, the most important predictors were fire, canopy overstory, and live basal area. And we also found that bird abundance and richness increased with prescribed fire and decreased with higher levels of overstory cover and live basal area. So getting into some potential reasons for these findings, as far as the overstory and live basal area findings go, as tree density and canopy closure increases, structural diversity tends to decrease due to less light reaching the forest floor. Other studies have shown that avian abundance and species richness may decrease as structural diversity declines, and also that the abundance of insectivorous birds in forests may decrease with less structural diversity. Potential reason for more open woodlands birds being found on the burned site is that fire opens up the understory. And a potential reason for fewer ground nesting birds is that fire would directly impact and reduce their available nesting habitat within the short term. Some potential reasons for more shrub and tree nesting birds is that low intensity fire does not impact tree nesting sites. And dependent on fire behavior, low intensity fire can leave some shrub on site. And some shrub nesters have also been shown in other research to use post-fire sites, even if little shrub is present. Getting into potential reasons for more ground foragers, flycatchers, and omnivore insectivore birds. The first reason may be that there's a large insect die-off shortly post-fire. So that leads to basically a bird buffet of toasted insects. So this is a brown thrasher from one of our sites, and you can see the ash on this bird's beak from rooting around for those insects. Some other potential reasons for this is that insect groups not killed off by fire would be ones below ground and up in the treetops. And also some insects have been shown in other research to increase within 1 to 2 months post-fire, such as beetles. I also want to highlight a couple of species that we found more of or exclusively on the burned site. So the first is red-headed woodpeckers, and these birds fly catch, and fire can create more open conditions for that foraging strategy. They also may ground forage, drill for wood-boring insects, and bark glean for adult beetles, all of which may increase post-fire. For indigo buntings, other research has shown that they may quickly utilize burned sites, even if little shrub cover is present. And brown thrashers ground forage for insects, as we saw earlier. And they'll also use sites with an annual burn cycle as long as some shrubby nesting vegetation remains. And the fire on our site did leave some oak shrub. And they will also utilize downed cover for nesting under, which is what that photo is. So wrapping up with some management implications, prescribed fire has been shown in other research to have long-term benefits for many bird species because it creates early successional habitat as sites regenerate. And our findings show support for prescribed fire benefits to birds as well. Within oak habitat, 15 to 16 years post-harvest using a regular Shelterwood system within the short term. So bird-focused oak habitat management within central Wisconsin should consider the combined use of irregular Shelterwood and prescribed fire to yield additional short-term benefits to the bird community, and also consider developing a more open overstory and lower live basal area if increased bird abundance and species richness is the goal. One thing to note, however, is that these recommendations in our models are not for species-specific management. With that, I want to thank my committee and the long list of partners for this project. It's my bibliography, and thank you for listening.
Right. Good afternoon. My name's Tom Parkin. I'm the senior forester with the Aitkin County Land Department. For quite a few years off and on, we've been partnering with NRRI, Josh Bednar here this last couple of surveys. And I'll describe the first couple of survey units that we did, and then Josh can take over on his presentation here. The one area we've been surveying is called the Cornish Hardwoods Management Area. It's north of Aitkin, north of Savannah State Park country. It incorporates about 1,500 acres. It's a large area of northern hardwoods. MHN 3.5s to 4.7s is kind of the native plant community up there. It's about 1,500 acres. The foresters and our management up there has been mostly uneven aged. So we're not doing a lot of aspen management. It's sort of long-term contiguous forests, gap management, patch cuts, single tree selection, stuff like that. Some of the, I think the earliest survey we started was back in 1998. Mark Jacobs started this. He was a forester back in that area, probably before then even. But we've done a couple on and off since up in Cornish. And we hope to get, in that big of an area, we're in there having timber sales every couple of years for sure. Between these patch cuts, we're still learning on entry levels, but we're looking at probably 15 to 20 years between. And we just started doing that this last couple of years for second entries. The second unit is something that I started up back in 2013, but it took quite a few years to get harvested, managed, and put together. We call that Big Bird, and it was a single timber sale. And that's located south of the Rice Lake Refuge. It's a 250 acre timber sale, all in group selection patch cuts. So in that 250 acre sale, there was 145 patch cuts. And we treated about 29% of the area. So we took out 29%. So you got about 71% that was left untouched. And that too is northern hardwoods, MHM 3.5, they're probably about a 4.7 on the NPC level there. The timber sale was almost 2,000 cords. Like I said, between a couple different loggers, bad winters, we didn't get it cut until 2020. But got some surveys done there, pre-harvest, post-harvest, just within the year. And then now this year, 2025, 5 years after the harvest. Difficult kind of getting back to these sites. I know Josh usually seems to have a story every time he ventures out in the woods, but if you got any other questions on our silviculture or forestry, you can talk to me later. Otherwise, I'll hand it off to Josh.
Okay, I'll primarily talk about the Big Bird study, so south of Rice Lake Refuge. And our main question is does managing northern hardwood forests with group selection gaps, half acre cuts, impact breeding birds? So we did some pre-harvest survey work from 2013 to 2015, some post-harvest surveys in 2020 and 2021, and we did follow-up surveys here in 2025. Study design here, at each location, this is the actual treatment area here. We had 15 surveys that we did. All those little blue dots are the treatment areas or the little patch cuts. And then the image all the way on the right there, that would be our control point, kind of right in the heart of Rice Lake Refuge. So just jumping into results, this is the results from the 2021 efforts that we did. We can see here that species richness, diversity, and non-forest species abundance all increased. Kind of no surprise there. So you have a mature forest, you punch some holes in it, you enter in a new suite of species. We did see mature forest species abundance decline. With that said, when you think about the amount of timber, when we correct the decline for the amount of timber removed, it was virtually no decline at all. So initially, very promising results. Again, that's basically year one after a harvest. We collected, this would be 5 years post-harvest, or approximately 5 years post-harvest. We haven't fully crunched this data here, but I just wanted to outline some notable summaries. This past year, we had a good number of chimney swifts, and I was talking to Tom about this. The nearest structure is a couple miles away in terms of a chimney or something they could nest in. So potentially hypothesizing that they could be nesting there in the site, which would be cool. But they're using that airspace there above that treatment area. Great crested flycatchers seem to increase here in 5 years post-harvest. Golden warblers exploded year 1 or 2 after the harvest, and about 4 or 5 years later they're still kind of hanging on. Had a couple pileated woodpeckers in the plot this year. Not sure if they're nesting in the plot or if they're just foraging in the plot. There's quite a bit of coarse woody debris within these gaps. And who knows if there was some opportunistic tree mortality events that happened. Rough grouse, we had 3 of those this past year in the plot. So it seems like they are benefiting from those cuts. Scarlet tanagers dipped down a little bit, but we also picked up some tree swallows. Wood thrush seemed to be moving kind of back into the harvest area, and yellow-throated vireos dropped a little bit as well. Again, with the chimney swifts and pileatids, I'd like to follow up a little bit more on these species here because it's seems like some opportunity was created here for those, which is interesting. But results are that uneven age management techniques used in big bird and the Cornish hardwood studies have maintained mature forest bird communities, which is great. The take home is to try new things, but monitor the response of that system. And so from our long-term monitoring data set, it basically suggests that our mature forest bird species are the species that kind of need the most help out there. And so if you are managing land or you have responsibilities to manage some sort of land or timber harvest or whatever, I think a great goal would be to try to somehow retain some of that mature forest bird community. So for example, if you're doing a 20-acre cut, retaining a half acre to an acre would potentially help with that cause. But that said, we have economical goals and ecological goals. And in order to do that, we kind of got to give up a little bit in terms of potentially the economics. So just in summary here, I didn't really present on the Cornish hardwood study, but that study site is a little further along in terms of the succession. So it's got a more mature forest bird community. We're starting to see more wood thrush back there. Golden-winged warblers are starting to fizzle out. Interestingly enough, we've got black-throated blue warblers in that McGregor area, which you typically think of them as a Northeast Minnesota species. They're definitely responding to the management because there is nothing really there in terms of a conifer component, or there's nothing there that says Superior National Forest in McGregor, Minnesota. And as far as Big Bird goes, again, it's lagging a little bit behind the Cornish area, but it is starting to transition into that more mature forest bird community. And these cuts do work. It seems like they're a great way to usher in a new suite of species, but keep that mature forest bird species within the stand.
Hey all, good to see you again this afternoon. Okay, I'm gonna give you fair warning. There's no birds in this presentation. I know, but I'm gonna direct all the pre-birding questions to the NRI bird group because they are monitoring. We just started with the vegetation and then had the opportunity to come through with LCCMR funding to add the birds, add the understory diversity, and add the carbon piece. So this is like phase one that I'll present on. And then in like.
I can speak on phase two.
Phase two, yeah, good, perfect. Okay, so early stand dynamics of white spruce and aspen mixedwood. This was part of Chelsea Semper's thesis work. So she's got her first chapter published from that, and I should have that citation in here. So, okay, what is a mixedwood forest? Well, a mixedwood forest is kind of what it sounds like. It's a mix of hardwoods and conifers. And the mix can be very variable, but it's basically one where one is not dominating. So it does not need a specific like percentage threshold, but basically there's some level of these hardwood species and conifer species together within an ecosystem. And neither is exceeding like 75 to 80%. But what those exact percentages are can be very variable. Okay, so why are we interested in mixed woods in Minnesota? Okay, well, we've heard this already more than once. Aspen is our most dominant forest type. However, aspen as we see it today does not represent the full range of how aspen forest types represent the ecosystem of aspen. Our aspen of today are really like, aspen is so good at so many things. And aspen is really good at aspen being the dominant species. But historically, the dynamics and ecosystems of these forests had a lot more conifer component in them. And so this is kind of the story throughout like Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, is that there's a lot of aspen. There's a lot of aspen that is mostly like 98% aspen. And if we think about what that means, like that can be a concern from a lot of different reasons, from an ecological standpoint, from an economic standpoint, from the whole range of, are we representing this forest type in the full range of the species that are in this forest type? And so that's where mixedwood management comes in. And so the idea is, how can we proactively move these forest types to be more diverse? And so moving from a 2-year-old aspen stand, and those of you who have worked in aspen, have done grouse surveys, have done anything, know that 2-year-old wall of aspen is literally a wall. Like, it is a lot to walk through. That's where you need your sunglasses, safety glasses, all the things. And then getting into these 20-year-old stands that are starting to shift, starting to create some complexity. And so thinking about how we do this. And so I will say that this really comes from work that UPM Blandon has been pioneering within the region. And they have a case study on this on the Great Lakes Silvicultural Library. Basically, if we think about a mixedwood management, we have a clear cut, and this is I'm naming it a clear cut because aspen does regenerate both asexually, but sexually. And so we're seeing both of those occur. And there is residuals. We then have regeneration with white spruce artificially planted and planted around 400 trees per acre. The aspen is going to come in naturally through that suckering and seeding. And then there's intermediate treatments that happen after that third growing season to release the spruce. Sometimes there's also some early kind of tending of the aspen. So you're at least releasing that spruce, you're giving it space to grow. And you may also be releasing a few of the other aspen, and then the aspen can kind of come in. And so, yes, I did. So this is an example of this in the Silviculture Library. And this is an example of work on the ground leading to research of, okay, how does this show up? How do we have the data to back this up in a replicated study? And so working with UPM Blanding, the Minnesota DNR, and the Minnesota Forest Resource Council, we established sites across Minnesota, mostly stationed around the Grand Rapids area. And we did this in conventional aspen. So aspen that was just clear cut with reserves and regenerated basically. And then aspen stands that are being converted into mixedwood management. And we have 4 different age classes. So 1 to 5 years, 6 to 10 years, 11 to 15 years, and 16 plus. It was really like 16 to 20, maybe 21. And that's really some of the older mixedwood stands is right in that 16 to 20 years. And some of the biggest things is when we look at regeneration, okay, we are checking that box. We are getting plenty of regeneration. I think we can all agree that like close to 20,000 stems per acre, we are checking that box. So we are getting regeneration across our mixedwood and our conventional. So conventional is in pink, mixedwood is in blue. When we look at our aspen regeneration, we see that we have higher regeneration in our conventional classes. But what we're seeing is as we start moving, the self-thinning. So we're seeing that density reduction. Okay, this is not surprising. We know how aspen grows. We know how it changes over time. What is cool and what's really important that we kind of got some documentation was, unless we plant spruce, it's not there. And so the other piece that was also really cool is that the spruce that are being planted are being retained. And so they generally were planted at about 400 trees per acre. We're seeing by that time, and this is in the seedling class, so this is the smallest class. And so by the 11 to 15 or 16 years, you're hoping that spruce is no longer a seedling, but a sapling. So I'll show that data later. But in those first years, these seedlings that are planted in an aspen stand are able to survive. And they're surviving after that brush sawing too. And so they're being released. So we're seeing good data of like, if you planted one, if you want a conifer component in your stand, you got to plant it. And two, if you planted, they're surviving. Those are great things to be able to put and document in terms of the investment into this. And so as we start looking at that sapling, so that next size class up, we're starting to see our aspen. Hold on. Sorry, things got cut off really funky here. Okay. Okay, so looking at TPA and basal area, we have greater TPA and basal area in pure aspen stands, but our average diameter of aspen is greater in our mixedwood stand. So we're releasing it. So we are seeing that trade-off in resource use and complementarity. So we can have a lot of little stands, or we can have a few bigger stands. Those resources are being allocated. And sorry, I don't know why it's doing this, but this is in the paper and I can share that link if anyone wants it. And then the other piece that's really cool is seeing how over time, I love a diameter distribution. This is another diameter distribution. Okay, so we have our DBH, we have our aspen, we have our mixedwood, and being able to see with that intentional planting how that shows up. And these are our overstory trees. So these are trees that are in the overstory size class. How that's showing up and how, again, we're doing this early intervention and we're seeing this shift in distribution in both the species, how the diameters are showing up, and what that resource is looking at. And then also being able to note, like, we do see our residuals. We are seeing our residuals show up in those earliest size classes in our aspen and kind of like trickle out. We see that a little less in our early mixedwoods, but those residuals are an important component and are being picked up in our surveys. So our main takeaways: conventional aspen stands are really good at regenerating really high densities of aspen. Mixedwoods, we're getting higher diversity of species composition, and that's through some intentional planting, but we also see some other species coming in and other species kind of coming in at those other size classes. This is a great tool to complement our toolbox. This is another way to add another example of aspen management. It's not doing it everywhere, but in thinking about where does it make sense to add some additional conifer component on the landscape, the sites that make sense, and also this is a really logistically intensive treatment. So making sure your sites have good access, because you're going to have people there planting and releasing. So thinking about how this could fit on the landscape and what that can mean. And then we heard earlier about the white spruce as an important component within that fiber industry. This is a way to maintain both the ecological and economic productivity of that stand. And so we are starting a remeasure of this from the forest vegetation stand. So we'll have really short term, so like 5 years, to be able to capture some of that immediate growth. And especially in some of these youngest age class, be able to capture, like, how are these trees growing from a carbon standpoint, but also from an economic standpoint. So we see differences in diameter when we're using a chronosequence. How does that show up when we do an actual repeated measure? And what are those growth rates looking like? So that we can consider, are there differences and what does that mean for our planning? And it's been, is it second season or first full season? First full season of bird surveys and small mammals that happened.
And I can talk about that just briefly. So what we're seeing from the bird standpoint, there's not much of a difference in the young sites, because a lot of that conifer is just this big here and the birds aren't really differentiating it. But when we get to that 15 to 20 year age class, that's where we're seeing the biggest differences. We're basically ushering in a new suite of species, that those conifer associated species. So magnolia warblers, black-birding warblers, black-throated green warblers, black-capped chickadees. So we're basically going from 5 to 10 species, from now to 10 to 20 species as well. Small mammals, we actually do have 2 years of small mammal data, and the jury's kind of still out on that. So we'll get to crunching that there this winter. But in terms of the bird side of things, yeah, when you can double your species richness, that's pretty darn cool. And I want to give props to Glenn for doing this because it's expensive to do this, and the fact that, you know, their Aspen is their main game, the fact that they're taking Aspen and, you know, bringing that conifer component, I think was pretty good. So.
That's it.
There was a question that came in, Marcella, it says, can you create mixedwood forest with other conifers?
Yeah, so there's an example here where it's aspen and red pine. And so thinking about that, and so one of the biggest things with the mixed wood in our region, if we're thinking about maintaining that commercial viability, is pairing the species with the aspen rotation. So how do you consider when the aspen is gonna be kind of ready for harvest with that long-lived conifer? And then the density of that long-lived conifer to hopefully bring up another cohort of aspen. So that second rotation of aspen will also fit in when the conifer is mature. And this is all slightly theoretical, so I look forward for what Landon's first experiments come up to that. They're, I think, 10 years away from that kind of first rotation in there. But it's really exciting to think about like how we use our silvicultural tools and the knowledge of these species to kind of then fit in with the economic markets of how these pieces come together.
Eric?
The contribution block project, I see there's like multiple close to 5 acres. Do you have a sense of how the total acreage of area harvested at a site is, or what's approximately?
Yeah, if you recall, my top here, probably 20 to 25% of the stand area, I imagine.
Is that done like a commercial capacity, or is it all kind of for operational?
No, it's like a couple of sites for summer harvest, which is, they do that there, but summer harvesting, but yeah, seeing them, they come in and cut, that was a struggle.
Okay, all right. Second is I guess the accessibility.
Yeah.
Makes that feasible.
Yeah, and they're lighter soils too, so that's what allowed for the summer access.
Okay.
And I guess it's also worth noting that the stands that were cut in the previous 2 to 3 years are going to be different than the stands that are cut in the next 2 to 3 years in that 5-year rotation. So after the next cuts occur, that's going to be even a larger proportion of the total landscape that is cut. But again, kind of diversifying the forest age matrix too.
Does Eastern Large Field and Mistletoe and some other things like that, is that adding back diversity that's kind of being lost? And add patchiness, clumpiness, grooviness, all those concepts that aren't present in current, say like DNR or standard operating procedure. You know what I mean?
Yes, I see, and I don't know if you're asking me this question or if there's others that you're asking that too.
Well, maybe it was before lunch that you gave that presentation, but
so I think Eastern dwarf mistletoe is a great example of like a species that does add patchiness to the landscape and is a component that maybe was underestimated in terms of its role in the stand development and stand dynamics of those systems. And so that can be a great example of like gap dynamics are a common component in lowland conifer forests. With ELB, that really was historically pre like 2000s, really only impacting basically dead or almost dead trees. Now I think we are seeing an example of a species that is acting outside of this historic range with climate change and really highlighting almost this mismatch between the insects' ability to adapt and change much quicker than Eastern March's ability to adapt and defend itself. And so we're really seeing
completely different shift in those dynamics compared to like ponderosa and pine and lodgepole pine have had millennia to build those relationships, but rather ELP and Eastern Larch is more like mountain pine beetle and like some of our high elevation pines, so like white bark pine or limber pine, we just haven't had those relationships, and then now almost moving at a light speed there.
On the prescribed fire and oak components, what was the kind of reaction between the I don't know what kind of land base this was on, if this was like forestry land or kind of a wildlife management area, but I was curious on the dynamic between the timber resource interests and the fire or the wildlife benefit and regeneration components.
Sure. So it was within a wildlife management area, so it was a project that University of Wisconsin Students Point was partnering with them to use the land for that study. And as far as like the balance of like wildlife benefit to, timber harvest and fire from the dam.
We just hear a lot of that concern here in Minnesota, at least about not wanting fire in timber lands, basically.
Yeah, so for this, there wasn't really a concern on these sites about like keeping them viable for like timber production necessarily. It's wildlife focused management, but also because it was a low, like mixed low to medium intensity fire, there was no like scarring really on the bottom of the trees. And it went through and mostly like avoided around. Let's look at the bigger trees.
Any concern about scarlet tanagers at all? Because these trees all seem to down scarlet tanagers. And then when you have smaller patches, you have vinegars coming in. So I don't know if anybody's looking at those older forests.
Yeah, we'll see what the second year of data brings for that Aitkin County study. I'm always hesitant to, jump to conclusions on just 1 year, but we'll see what year 2 brings. It's something that we're mindful of just because of, like the experimental cuts we're doing with Marcella and the peatland systems, like ton of edges, not necessarily a great thing for nesting birds or whatever. It's something that we're thinking about.
How did your loggers react to the big bird cut? I mean, sounds like it took them a while to get in there, but did they seem to like that, or was there some?
Oh, there's
conversations?
That's a lot of patches to go find throughout the woods. Most guys are fine cutting a patch cut sale, maybe one a year. They can go through that just fine, but they do get old and they're a little time consuming, and it's usually not very good quality wood. But otherwise, some guys are like, well, wood is wood, it weighs up and we can sell it, so whatever kind of makes the market work out. And most I will have had a logger not try one.
You said you haven't?
I don't think I have.
Go for it.
For the patch cut, did you thin the matrix at all? In that northern hardwood?
On Big Bird, no.
Okay.
The Cornish hardwoods, for sure, there's ridges of oak, there's some single tree selection. We were trying different things over the last 30 years. So there was something in between of the Cornish. That's a much larger scale.
That made it more appealing, being able to thin the matrix, just being able to pull more wood out of there.
The logger?
Patch cut, yeah.
Actually, the loggers like the patch cuts because you're cutting 30 the acre wood. And it's right there, it's set up for you, you know where it is. When you're thinning the matrix in between, they have to search around, they would have to spend more time figuring out how to lay trees down individually and doing that way. It doesn't matter. If the prices are good, if they're getting $300 a cord for red oak on the mill, and that's gonna push them to separate their goals and deal with other markets too, so that's a big part of it.
Was that conventional or cut away?
Conventional. Poultry's getting delivered, they'll stage in different areas.
Any chipping?
Nope, that one. We have, maybe 1 or 2 chipping operations in the whole county.
I have a question on the, conservation, for that half acre, size, you guys play with other size, like bigger or larger, how would so on the half acre gap size? I guess, looking at it from maybe the experimental design standpoint, if there's option to look at other gap sizes, it's kind of curious, but.
Yeah, just from, trying different things, we used to paint the boundaries, different sizes. Kind of notice how the canopies grow in, what species come up. Half acre was kind of seemed to be in the sweet spot in the middle. Depending on what you want to do, some of these were stamped out, just a logger select radius, GPS the middle. The logger's got an Benza map, you can see where he's out cutting, and there's just punching half acre holes. Other spots will go and paint the perimeter, so they might get as big as an acre, or they'll be as small as quarter acre. And if you do it that way, you can lock some seed trees on the boundaries if you'd like, or cater to other goals that you might have out of the woods.
So these stands that you're leaving, they're permanently, you're not gonna go back in and grab them again?
For other entries?
Yeah.
No, I'd go back for other entries for sure.
What's your year stagger?
Well, we thought we could maybe get into them every 10 years, but now we're learning we probably can't, so we're gonna push it back to 13 to 20. And now we're just starting to get those second entries now over this last year.
So is this stuff
So
available or is it dying off with the old stuff don't last forever?
no,
What's your take on what, obviously you're cutting one batch and then you're gonna leave another, and you're gonna go back in and get it. It's the same age as the first time around.
right, but they're already kind of multiple age to begin with. So you're gonna have 4-inch maple in the understory, then you're gonna have your 110-year-old maple or red oak up in the overstory, a lot of the basswood stuff. So it's already got that kind of tendency to be uneven age to begin with. But yeah, our woods are old and you see dieback and things are changing as they go along. And we'll just kind of see what the future brings, but our goal is to get at least 3 different age classes in these stands. And kind of go from there, I guess.
It wouldn't work with Aspen, straight Aspen, but
You know, we've done a few of these patch cuts in Aspen, we planted some of the spruce or balsam, kind of bigger sizes, like 1 acre cuts. I think it would work out, I guess it all kind of depends on the soil and what's going out there. If you want to diversify your aspen, then you can make the rotation ages longer, older. You know, if you do these patch cuts, you're gonna have shade on the south end of them. So that maybe will shade some of the other regen or allow some of the or something to come in. I don't know.
yeah, it's all money driven, so it's hard to. When you start planting, like the spruce is only a handful, or actually a couple of months, you can use a certain big enough for solid. It's hard to just, I mean, what's the future hold?
It is hard to justify when you just take aspen and convert it. You know, we're a county entity, we have a fiduciary responsibility, you want to do what makes sense. Financially as well.
But
I think with that, like, we don't know what the future is gonna hold, and 20 years ago, we were not talking about emerald ash borer. And now that is a huge impact to us. And so thinking about, we have aspen as monocultures in our state. We don't know which species might be the next emerald ash borer or aspen. And so that would be devastating if we had something like that. So how do we consider both our current financial realities but also the unknowns of our future financial realities as well as ecological realities. And so this is not me saying you need to diversify everything, but accounting for that, like, there may be some treatments that are more expensive today that may give us a greater financial resiliency and ecological resiliency in 40, 50, 60 years, because one, we don't know what the market is. We don't know what our species composition or our threats might be. And so how do we make sure, just like every financial advisor is going to tell you, have a diversified portfolio. How are we diversifying our Aspen portfolio so we can maintain that resource into the futures?
There's also some landowners that aren't necessarily completely driven by that financial perspective. So there's, you know, those woodland landowners who are really interested in what can I do to add some diversity in my land. Maybe they're looking to add wildlife diversity. So the added benefit across the landscape is that resilience to climate change, because that's going to change our dynamics in addition to maybe new threats that might be involved. But there's I've talked to Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, you know, a number of different tribes, a number of different counties, even some state wildlife management areas, and a number, you know, they don't all have the ability to have that flexibility, but in many cases, they might. And so looking at what they can do when they have that type of flexibility is really interesting to them and can be valuable for the landscape.
One more question. So Pagan,
Yeah, go for it.
Thanks. I guess just to add on that conversation, some organizations, I'm with the Nature Conservancy, so we find donors to help cover the cost of this kind of stuff and public funds. There's approaches to add in diversity. But my question is though, on the carbon, I don't know if Marcella has any data yet on the carbon end of the Mixedwood stuff. I mean, I'm guessing you're collecting that, but I'm curious if you're seeing some differences, and if you expect some differences.
Yeah, so that's especially where we're wanting to get that repeated measurement. And so there are models of carbon for like conventional aspen. And so we know how aspen grows pretty well. What we don't know is how aspen, and especially when we're doing these early kind of release treatments, and if we're seeing larger diameters, what does that mean in terms of that carbon storage, but also sequestration ability? And does that mean, like, if we're getting larger diameters, is that aspen more likely going to move from, instead of a paper product, maybe a longer lived component with a larger diameter at the same rotation age? And so I think there's a lot of trade-offs, but one of the things we really want to get at is like having a repeated measures with the exact same plots to be able to really calibrate a good model to know, like, is what we're seeing, is what the model's predicting what we're actually seeing on the ground, and what does that mean in terms of growth at these really young stages to be able to then better project out into like 40, 50 years for a rotation.
all right, let's give a round of applause for our participant.